Video, and this is about Silverstone in 1950. So this was of course the 1950 British Grand Prix. This was a really important date in Formula One history, and of course an important race in Formula One history. This race is probably looked back on, and after 74 years, it is now evolved into a much more bigger and better sport, of course. So this is my dive and research into the first ever F1 race to ever be held, and this was of course held in Silverstone in 1950. So let's get started with my information and research that I did on this first race. So back then, this race was quite a little different. As you can see, Silverstone looked much more different, and it was different. Back then, it had a lot more straights, so it was almost like a spa back then because there was so much straights, but there was barely any corners. So there wasn't much turning or cornering or any of that. It's much shorter, of course, with being only 4.649 kilometers in length. So it was really short. Compared to the modern day one, it wasn't that long. Of course, much more different back then because the cars, they were built much more differently compared to the ones we see today. So I bet that the old ones were really struggling to turn, especially back then. So I figured that's why they had a lot more straights than corners. Of course, here's some important stats that I gathered on this race. So first off, this race, because it was the first one, it was quite a spectacle back then. So of course, this race had over 100,000 fans that came to watch it. So that was quite a lot of fans back then, and it was quite an event at Silverstone. It took place on May 13th, 1950. This was of course the race date. So it went from May 11th all the way to May 13th of 1950. Um, and the race, of course, was around 70 laps around the Silverstone circuit. So, um, although we have 50 laps in the modern day because this one was a shorter one and faster circuit, it was 70 laps. So, a pretty decent amount of laps in this race. So, this race, of course, took place over 3 days. So, around Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And as you can see, there's an old 1950 F1 car racing through. As you can see, there's a whole load of fans sitting in the stands and watching the race. Of course, as you can see in that photo, there's barely a protective barrier there, as back in the 1950s, they barely had any barriers back then. So it was a pretty different time period, and it was much more different compared to what we see today. So in this first F1 race, I found the driver roster, and in this roster, as you can see, there's some few notable names that you can see. Of course, one of the big ones being Juan Manuel Fangio, of course, and Louis Chiron. Now, Louis Chiron was back then actually the most experienced F1 driver on the grid. He had the most experience in racing and cars, so he was probably the go-to favorite. Fangio, on the other hand, wasn't really most. In fact, he had dropped out of school to go into mechanics, so he was up front, but no one would really know what he would end up doing later on. Anyway, there was also different other people that you can see, of course, not really memorable, and most of the names you probably never even heard of before, but there you have it. And of course, for the entries and the constructors, back then there was only around around 4 to 5 constructors in this F1. So of course, the notable ones being Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Era, Talbot Lago, and Alta, of course. These were the main constructors, of course, in this series, of course. Alfa Romeo being the most dominant out of all of them, of course, along with Maserati, of course, which were probably their biggest rivals back then. Um, as you can see, of course, back then they actually didn't have teams. It was more of like an individual entry. So they were mainly competing for themselves and not really for themselves and for the team. So back then it was a little different, and it didn't really matter much about like having teammates and all that kind of stuff because it was mainly more individual. Now, of course, as you can see, the tire compound was a little bit more interesting because back then they only had two tire compounds. They had a P tire compound and a D tire compound. Now, I'm guessing that the P tire was probably the fastest one, and the D one is probably the more long and endurance tire. So, It's pretty crazy to see how much we've come in tire compounds, especially with now being three compounds instead of now two. So that was also pretty interesting that I found. So yeah, also the model, of course, as you can see that the era, you can see the 4CL and the LBC, which was mainly for the Alfa Romeos. So that was also really interesting too. Qualifying. Now, qualifying took place on Friday of the weekend. So this was, of course, middle of the weekend. So it's pretty similar to what we see in modern day F1 with Friday being practice, Saturday being qualifying, and Sunday being the race. It was the same as except that the practice was on Thursday, the qualifying's on Friday, and the race was on Saturday. So on the Friday of the weekend, Giuseppe Farina took pole position with the 1 minute 50.8, so it gave him the first pole in Formula One history. Alongside him was Fagioli, Fangio, and Parnell, the other Alfa Romeos. So as you can see, Farina took pole, followed by Fagioli, Fangio, and Parnell. Back then, of course, in the 1950s, they didn't have the rows. They had completely different styles and rearranging of the rows. So in modern day Formula One, we would see one car a little ahead of the second one, and then behind the first car, then it would be the third, and then the fourth. However, back then in the 1950s, it was all four cars would start alongside each other. So it wasn't like modern day Formula One. It was actually all alongside. So although he took pole position, back then it wasn't a really huge advantage as he still started alongside other people on the grid. The race. Now the race is probably the most important part of this whole thing. And of course, I at first when I started researching about this, I really thought that Fangio had actually won this race, but apparently I was wrong because Farina he absolutely destroyed over the weekend. He first took pole and then he ended up dominating the race. He led for most of the race, of course, apart from the pit stops. Um, Fagioli, of course, finished behind him in second, and Juan Manuel Fangio, who I thought would win the race, actually ended up retiring after a broken oil pipe. So that was really interesting, and I actually didn't know about that. And as you can see in the leader lap ladder, of course, you can see that Farina has absolutely led for most of the race, of course, with Fangio and Fagioli leading for only about a lap or two. And of course, as you can see in the small picture in the corner, you can see Farina taking the win, of course, with the checkered flag waving. So that was quite a historic sight, and although it wasn't the most quite entertaining, it was a huge history spectacle for Formula One. So thanks for watching this video, of course. This was my deep dive and research into the first F1 race. So, and I learned a lot from this. So, I hope that this video was informative and helped you in learning more about Formula One. Of course, I'll be uploading more content about how Formula One and the important aspects of Formula One. So please subscribe to see more of that kind of content. And for that, goodbye.